Yeah, thanks for everybody who was able to join us here in person. But again, thanks to all of the folks who are joining us online. And of course, also thanks to the sponsors that were mentioned in the previous session, who are the whole reason we're able to get together today. So I'm excited to come today and talk about recipes. I've heard other people involved with recipes describe it as sort of, in some ways, the meat of Drupal Starshot or Drupal CMS. But of course, lots of fun food analogies that we're going to dive into along the way. I do have a few QR codes as part of the presentation. I will share these slides. There's a link at the end. But if you feel like you might want to do a deep dive on something that I'm covering, there are QR codes that you can use. So if you're that type of person, keep your phone handy and you'll be able to jump right into those links as we go along. So for anyone that I haven't already met, my name is Martin Anderson Klutz. I'm a senior solutions engineer at Acquia. I'm also on a podcast called Talking Drupal. Last year, I was named the events recipe track lead for Drupal Starshot, and I've done a bunch of certifications in Drupal and a bunch of other things, including usability. So it's an exciting day, right? It's the launch of Drupal CMS, right? Round of applause. Exciting day for the community. In terms of today, we're going to talk about a few different things. We're going to start by sort of explaining, like, why do we even need this thing called recipes? We're not going to waste any time. We're going to jump in and actually see recipes in action in terms of what is it that they actually bring to Drupal and Drupal CMS specifically. We're going to talk about what goes into a recipe. We're going to talk about how you use recipes, some of the things that we've been working on, and some of the things that we've recently finished, and finish up with a little talk about how you can get involved, because hopefully by the end of our talk, you'll be so inspired, you'll just be itching to jump in and get started helping. So why do we need this thing called recipes? Well, for a long time in the Drupal community, we've had things called distributions and install profiles, which were really effective at giving you a more robust starting point for a specific kind of functionality that you might want. So one of my early Drupal mentors used to talk about Drupal as a development platform pre-configured as a CMS, but if you specifically wanted an e-commerce website, you could use the Commerce Kickstart distribution as a way to have all that commerce functionality built out for you. Or if you wanted some kind of a nonprofit fundraising site, you could use Red Hen Razor as a way to build out a website that had a lot of those capabilities for you out of the box. But there were a variety of different downsides. And I feel like, show of hands, who here has used a distribution in Drupal? And who among those has never had a problem using a distribution in Drupal, right? Like all the hands are down, right? Right, exactly. So the problem is that it's difficult to update on both sides, right? So as the distribution maintainer, there's a lot of work that goes into keeping that up to date. And then that creates problems if you, as the site owner, now see that there's like a Drupal critical security update, but you can't actually update that site until the distribution maintainer has, created their own release with that update. So lots of pain points there. You have to start with the distribution. So it's not like you can start building your Drupal website, hear about this distribution, go like, oh, I should just switch over to that. It's like, no, if you're halfway done building your site, sorry, you got to either start over or just accept that, you can't basically adopt that. You can't mix and match. So you couldn't say, I want to use parts of Commerce Kickstart and parts of Red Hen Razor. You sort of have to pick a lane. And then, there wasn't a lot of visibility in terms of making it easy to find some of those distributions as well. So to address a lot of these pain points, Dries a few years ago proposed this idea of recipes. So originally we called them a few different things. Eventually we settled on recipes. But basically the idea is to have sort of a lightweight and composable way to add functionality to your website. So recipes can install modules, but don't have any, there's no PHP, JavaScript, or CSS code of their own. So it's really just sort of a composer.json and some YAML. They're composable, so you can have a recipe that actually only pulls together a bunch of other recipes. So they can sort of, play well together that way. And people who work on recipes will be quite emphatic that the terminology is that you apply a recipe to a Drupal website, you don't install it, because notionally, the only change that it makes to your website directly is meant to be the site configuration. So the end change that you get from applying a recipe should be the same as if a Drupal expert came and did the same changes to your website. And also, they're meant to be easy to share. So the idea is, you get the benefit of Drupal experts who are sort of subject matter experts in certain areas have distilled down what they consider the best approach to achieve certain kinds of common patterns in terms of what websites need. And now you can drop those in and get the benefit of that without having to learn like, oh, well, there's 8 different modules for geolocation, which is the one that I need and is best suited for my use case, and how does it play with all the other things? You can install one recipe for locations, and it does all of that setup for you. But I think probably the main thing to think about is recipes are an easy way to implement those community provided best practices. So again, it's that idea of, as a site owner, I want to do these 8 different things rather than having to go through the thousands of different modules on Drupal.org, understand how to best configure them. You can find the recipes that correspond to those, and that gives you a really solid starting point for building out your website. So I did bring a little giveaway. These are Drupal 11 sunglasses. So the first person who can name a recipe on Drupal.org will get these Drupal 11 sunglasses. What's that? Sure, we'll go with that. Technically, Drupal CMS is in itself a recipe. So you could have just said Drupal CMS, but there are actually, and we'll get to it, a lot of recipes posted as well. So there we go. Blog recipe. Well, so I know prize for second place. All right. So with that, we're going to jump into a live demo and sort of see the recipes in action. So when you go to install Drupal CMS, this is exactly what it looks like. The first thing that you see is this screen that says started creating faster. And it presents you with these choices of like, what are capabilities that you want available in your site? And these are all recipes that are built and shipped with Drupal CMS. So we could say we want events and we want to be able to post person profiles. And then we'll just quickly go through the rest of these steps. Some people will call this our Toronto launch demo. Give it an email and password to use for the site. And now it's going to go through and actually take, hopefully not more than a couple of minutes, because otherwise this presentation could drag. But you can see now it's actually doing a local install of Drupal CMS that we're going to be able to go in. But you can see it's applying a variety of different recipes. There are a number that are sort of standard and installed by default in Drupal CMS, but then it gives you that option to add other ones as part of that installation process. So I'm just going to use this as an opportunity to grab a drink of water as well. So there we go. It's just about done. And now it's going to redirect to something that is also new to Drupal, or at least, again, as part of a standard experience, which is taking you to something other than either the home page or your user page, but this idea of a dashboard to try and give you some ideas of like, here's how to get started with your Drupal website. So you've got Drupal news and events at the bottom. We've got recent content, which has been sort of the default behavior when you get to the node page, but it's got some top tasks here. And there is discussion about how this whole dashboard concept could be better leveraged by some of the other recipes. But I just wanted to show here that having enabled those recipes as part of our install now, we can go ahead and create, events and person profiles. So they've kind of done their job. There's also views associated with those and some other things. But I also wanted to show here, if we go in, maybe we decide later on that actually we want to have a blog too. So if we go down here into our extend, we do have this recipes section. And here's where you can also browse through that same set of recipes and actually get a little bit more of a description. So maybe as part of the install process, you weren't too sure, like, I'm not sure of how, it's providing events is exactly what I want. You can wait and install those later. It'll show you in Project Browser which ones have already been installed, but we could say, let's go ahead and select the blog and then go ahead and install the selected ones. And now the blog is installed. That was done asynchronously, so we have to reload the page to actually see the change in the create menu. But let's do that. And now if we go in here, we can see we have the ability to add a blog post. So that just gives you a sense of, I mean, out of the box, as part of the installation process, we were able to choose some recipes. It was very simple to do that all through the UI, even after the fact. So I think it's a real game changer for Drupal in terms of the ability to sort of quickly build out not only your content architecture, but also there's some sort of like customer facing elements to some of the recipes. There are ones for things like accessibility, data privacy. So across a lot of different areas, it really gives you the ability to build out a very robust Drupal site without having to have a lot of detailed Drupal knowledge, particularly in some of these different areas. So let's dive back in here. If you wanted to explore some of the other recipes that are available outside Drupal CMS, there is this wiki page that's being called the Recipes Cookbook. It has a variety of site starter recipes. So if you wanted to do something other than either Drupal core or Drupal CMS, there are other starting points. There's also functionality specific recipes. So if you want to add site-wide alerts or locations as nodes or different things like that, there are recipes on there for those. There's also tools in there for creating recipes. So maybe you have some ideas for recipes that you want to be able to share with the community. There's tools in there to help you generate those and then create those as Drupal projects. So let's actually dive a little bit deeper into what makes up a recipe. So in some ways, recipes are similar to other kinds of projects like modules or themes. Certainly, you'll probably find that all of the ones, particularly on Drupal.org, will have a composer.json file so that all of the dependencies can be brought in. And then most critically, they'll have this recipe.yaml file, which is really what the recipes system uses to understand what are the changes it needs to make to the site based on this recipe that's been provided. Within that recipe.yaml, there's a section for recipes, so it can call on other recipes that should be applied. There is a section to install. So this is other projects like modules or themes that should get added to the website. You can tell it what configuration you want imported. So when you provide or specify modules or themes as part of that install section, it's actually not going to install all of the configuration provided by those projects. It's going to import basic configurations. So think about like settings for a particular module. That's sort of the basic configuration, but any provided configuration entities. So when you think about like the views module, when you first install your site, you get a whole variety of different views kind of out of the box. So if you were to have some kind of a basic site recipe and you called the views module as part of the install, but didn't specify anything in config import, you wouldn't have any of those default ones that the views module ships by default. But within this section, you can say either for these particular projects, bring in everything, or specific ones that you want to make sure are going to be available on the site after the recipe is applied. And then there's the section for config actions. So, and who here has heard of config actions before as part of recipes? A couple hands. Sounds like it's kind of a new concept. So I mentioned earlier about how people had said recipes are kind of like the meat of Drupal CMS. I like to think of config actions as like the hot sauce that gives it like, the excitement. Config actions are sort of a variety of different ways that you can customize the site in particular ways, and it's extremely flexible. So where previously within modules, you could bring in configuration files, but it had to be very explicit. So change this value to that. And it was kind of a very strict one-to-one mapping. If there were differences, then it would basically say, this can't be installed. Whereas with config actions, you can be a lot more flexible to say, if this doesn't exist, then create it this way. You can say things like, make this one change to all available content types. So it's a much more flexible way, and we'll get into some more details about how all of that works, but just understand, to me, config actions are probably the most exciting part of recipes. There is also the ability within a recipe to have a config folder. So this is the same as having a config folder in like a module or a theme. Whatever YAML files you have in there will get sort of brought in explicitly. And then you can also have a content folder. So you can have YAML files of content entities that you want the recipe's runner to actually create within the system where the recipe is getting applied. So here's an example of what that might look like. On the cookbook that we talked about, this is one of the recipes that you'll see listed called alerts. So having site-wide alerts is sort of a common pattern that we see across a wide variety of sites. And we can see here that we have, the composer.json file. We have a folder for config. We have our content folder, and actually notice that it has subdirectories that are keyed by the ID of the kind of entity that needs to be created. So in this case, it's providing 3 different taxonomy terms by default, as well as the recipe file there as well. All right, the composer.json is going to be pretty similar to what you've seen in other kinds of projects. So, name, description, you can give it keywords. Critically, though, the type needs to be Drupal recipe. If you're adding a recipe to Drupal.org, you need to create that as a general project. So really this type value is critical so that the composer endpoint can expose these as Drupal recipes. Require is like with any other kind of project where you define the different requirements that need to be brought in. And there is also this suggest tag where you can say, if you're using this recipe, then you might want to consider these other things. Right now, this is only actually output on the command line as sort of a suggestion at the end of the output. There is some discussion that potentially maybe Project Browser one day will actually present these as sort of like, you could actually, opt into those at that stage through the UI, which would be nice, but that's sort of for future consideration. Within the recipe.yaml, there are a few elements that are going to be pretty similar to what you might see today in like an info.yaml. So name, description, the type of recipe that it is. But now you have this recipes section where you can call those other recipes. So in this case, it's calling, this other recipe called Sue content types. But then you can also have this install section where you say these are individual projects. So, modules or themes that we want to make sure get installed as this recipe is applied. And then you can say, for the configuration, because as we talked about, it's not going to by default bring in all of the different configuration entities that those projects provide. You can say either, give it the wildcard to say bring in all of the provided configuration entities, or you can say these are the specific ones that we want to make sure are going to be available because our recipe depends on those. Now you can also have config actions. So the way the config actions work is it starts with the name of the actual configuration that needs to be modified. Then you provide the name of the action that it needs to take. There can be sort of single or plural versions of these, so you sometimes you'll need to pay attention to those. And then in this case, with simple config update, you're just providing, what's the actual sort of key and what's the value that it needs to be changed to. But we'll get into some of the finer details in terms of the actual actions that are available. So depending on, I would say there's sort of fundamentally 2 types of config actions. There are some that can apply to any kind of configuration entity, and these are the ones you see here. So we call them globally applicable. So simple config update is one that you'll see a lot in recipes. So it's kind of one of those like, if this thing isn't there, here's how it should be created. But if there is one, then let's leave it alone and move on. You can also do create if not exists. There's a set component, which is doing things like adding a field to like view modes or form modes. There is this idea of create as a more sort of explicit. It doesn't do that conditional in terms of if something already exists, ignores it. And then set third-party setting can be useful for configuration of a variety of different like widgets and plugins and so on. I'll grab a drink here. So fundamentally, the other type of config action are ones that are more specific to individual kinds of configuration entities. So if you're modifying roles, you've got this config action specifically for granting permissions. If you're working on workflows, there are these config actions to say, apply this workflow to these content types or these vocabularies. If you're talking about fields, there's a config action to say things like add to all bundles, right? So you can see how for different kinds of configuration entities, there are different types of things that you would want to do. And there's a whole library of those available. So again, there's a QR code here. There's a huge documentation page that lists out all of those different configuration And I think it's even sectioned that way, so it makes it sort of easy to understand. But that's a great reference if you're going to get started actually creating your own recipes. There are also a number of these config actions that will accept wildcards in terms of where they should apply. So we can say we want to grant permissions to all roles, as an example, or maybe we want to say we want to set a component and have it apply to every view display of every content type, right? So you can think about if you were going to do those explicitly one by one on a big site, that could be a lot of configuration you would have to provide, and you wouldn't necessarily know you would catch all of them because you might write it for, a particular moment in time, and then somebody adds another content type, and you rerun or reapply that recipe, and now you've got one that doesn't have that. Whereas by having these wildcards, it's it's going to catch all of the ones that are available and so on. So lots of flexibility that have gone into the design of the whole recipe system here. One that I'm really excited about is the set of config actions that are specifically for placing blocks. Because previously you could provide configuration that would place blocks, but you had to explicitly say the name of the theme. So I can design, previously I could have a module that placed a block, let's say, but it would only work for Claro if that was the default theme. Whereas, or no, probably not Claro, but Olivero, let's say, if the site had a custom theme, the block would still get placed in Olivero, so it wouldn't do anything effectively for that site. Whereas now you can do things like, say, place a block in the default theme. Instead of having to explicitly know what region it should go into, you can provide sort of an array to say, if it's this theme, put it in that region. And then you can also provide a fallback. So you're probably going to want to pick something that's fairly universal. Excuse me, so you can say, if we can't find one that's more specialized where we know we want it to go, then maybe just put it in like the content region or something, so that the site builder at least sees something and then they can move it if they want. You can also do things like, say, position. So before you could say, put it at, the numerical ID. So like 1 or 0, or maybe you put it 0, thinking that that's going to put it at the top. But this particular site has like -2 and -5. And, so it ends up well down the list. So now you can say position first. And the recipe runner is going to do the work of figuring out what's the numerical ID that it needs to be first or last, or those kinds of things. So you can see how this becomes a much more flexible way to say, this is the intent of what I'm trying to create. And then Drupal is going to do all the work of actually figuring out where it needs to go, how to place it and all those kinds of things.
That's what it is, like meant to really like work, right? So basically when you get to this kind of non-developers, this is the thing that is going to work and not die, and people don't know what to do. So that's fantastic.
Yeah. Yep. As you say, particularly for the end, the type of user that we're trying to design Drupal CMS for, having something that's much more sort of flexible and reliable, I think, in terms of achieving the end goal, huge step forward. Config actions is also an API. So if you wanted to have your module create its own config action, basically you need this kind of an annotation. So you give it an ID. You can optionally provide an array of entity types. So maybe you want this to only apply to user roles or to taxonomy terms or those kinds of things. And you also have the option to provide a deriver class, again, if you want to sort of have different code handle different situations and some of those kinds of things. But already, I believe Search API has already created its own config action. But I think, in the same way that we talked about different modules probably providing, AI agents and some of those kinds of things, we're probably going to see a lot of modules providing their own config actions moving forward as well. Some best practices around recipes. Idempotency is a word that I had probably never heard before last year, right? But it's this idea that you should be able to apply a recipe again and again to your site and not have it throw some kind of an error. To achieve that, a lot of times, you're probably going to need to use things like the create if not exists actions and some of those other kinds of things to sort of where it might run into something that's not exactly expected by the recipe to handle that gracefully. But you're probably going to need to do some testing, particularly if you're releasing this to the community, to make sure that that works well. I would say generally the idea is to try and keep recipes fairly granular and then have more of like a meta recipe that pulls together all of the elements in terms of what you need. So we'll talk about some examples as we go through. And definitely sort of publish and share these. I mean, I feel like the promise of recipes is that as a community, we can, instead of having it being very fractious and everybody, using things in slightly different ways, if we can say for common use cases, here's the best way to approach it, even just as a starting point, and then sort of build out and get more granular from there. I think that's going to make Drupal feel a lot more accessible to people, and as they come to it and don't necessarily have that deeper knowledge. So here's another example of a recipe.yaml here. Again, this is actually released as a contrib recipe, so it's something that you could pull into your site and start using. You can see it relies on a variety of sort of core and contrib modules. It actually does specify some configuration entities that should get imported as part of getting it applied, and then it has a variety of these config actions. So saying if there isn't already a location content type, go ahead and create it with some defaults. And then these are the different components that should be set on these. Here's how they should be ordered, all those kinds of things. So in this case, this is the form display within the same recipe. If you go into it, you'll see that there's ones for the actual view mode, both I think teaser and default. So, a lot of those things are what you want to sort of think through as part of creating your recipe as well. We did also mention that recipes can provide content. Actually, I should probably do a time check. How are we doing here? Okay. Good. All right. So recipes can provide content. Effectively, it basically needs to be encoded into a YAML file. What the recipe runner has done is it's effectively brought in all of the code that was previously in the default content module to be able to do that. So if you've been using default content previously, you'll find this completely seamless. But effectively, you just need your content wrapped in YAML and then put into, as we saw, the sort of subdirectories keyed by the entity ID. And then when you run the recipe, it'll get automatically imported. If you want to add content to your recipe, the best way to do that is using the default content module to actually do the export. It'll put it into those subdirectories, and you can just drop that directly into your recipe and you're set to go. And then the content will be validated and imported as you apply the recipe. So it's pretty seamless. I would say, the export probably takes a little getting used to the first, 1 or 2 times you do it, but after that, it's pretty seamless. How do you apply recipes? Well, as we saw back in the demo, it's pretty simple, particularly as part of the installer. It actually gives you a nice simple prompt there. You can use the project browser in Drupal CMS to apply recipes, but today those are the only recipes that actually work in project browser. So if you're wanting to use more contrib recipes, you're going to be using the command line. Fortunately, recent versions of Drush actually have a wrapper for the core script that's within Drupal. So you can just use a Drush recipe and then give it the path to be able to find the recipes. And the composer template actually for Drupal 11 and newer actually puts those outside the doc route. So just know you're going to have to precede those with the 2 dots. Also good to know the order in which the recipe runner is going to walk through those steps. So it's going to start by applying any other recipes. Then it's going to install modules and themes, again, only importing the basic configuration. Then it's going to import any of the specified configuration entities, again, as part of that install section in your recipe.yaml. Then it's going to apply any of the configuration actions that you specified. And then the last step is going to be importing any of the content within that content directory of your recipe. A big part that went into the development of recipes was actually moving core install profiles into sets of recipes, really to understand, firsthand for the core developers, if we're going to move to this process of having distributions replaced by recipes, we need to know firsthand that the recipe system is comprehensive enough to basically be able to handle all of the use cases that were previously handled in distributions. And so there were a lot of learnings that came out of that. And that's why if you look at, the recipes, the evolution of recipes, there was a lot of movement in last year because this process was really undertaken. And today, if you do the standard install of Drupal in Drupal 11, it's actually applying a recipe as opposed to using an install profile as well. So if you use the standard recipe It actually it's comprised of a lot of the more granular recipes itself. So things like article content type, page content type, editorial workflow. Those are all recipes that if you were creating your own sort of, alternative site starter recipe, you could use those instead of having to sort of recreate those yourself. Definitely always, as I would say, as a best practice, if you're doing the same thing as core, try and see if there's a recipe from core that you can sort of bring in and adopt, and then just add to that whatever you need to do in a more custom way. So what are some of the things that have gone into the recipes and really to get us to the current state? Well, we had this phase 1 roadmap, and that is now actually completed and delivered on. It was actually shipped as part of Drupal 10.3 and then a few more improvements as part of Drupal 11, but really still officially an experimental API. So if we look at phase 1, it was really sort of, the core required functionality to make this recipe system work in the way that it needed to deliver on the promise of recipes. So, excuse me, being able to, parse out recipe.yaml and composer.json files, being able to have a recipe apply other recipes as part of that Drupal runner, being able to go through that recipe.yaml file, figure out the other Drupal extensions, and then be able to enable those, but not import all of the configurations so that you could be selective there. Being able to specify what is the set of configuration entities that you want brought in, being able to do things like import the content and config folders, really all of the different things that we've talked about, including that API, so that now other module developers can provide their own. I'm so embarrassed. That's so like 1990. Phone on muted.
Better be my phone.
Right. All right. There we go. Surprise. I would have thought it would be in the demo, but there we go. A quick note about the timeline of recipes. So you can see it was actually way back in DrupalCon. I think it was the first DrupalCon Portland, or maybe not first, but like first recent one, May of 2022, where Dries proposed this idea of a more granular approach to recipes. And there was more talk about it in DrupalCon Europe that year in Prague. And then for the next sort of year and a half, I would say, there was a lot of sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of like foundational work for recipes in terms of getting a lot of the recipe runners sort of started. Building out sort of this config validation piece, because when the recipe runner was first implemented, if it started to apply a recipe and then ran into a problem, your site configuration was left in kind of a broken state. So now there's this idea of a configuration snapshot that it creates. And then that way, if it hits a problem, it just rolls back to that configuration snapshot. So it made the whole process of applying recipes to your site a lot more reliable. And then really, I think it was when the core contributors started to go through that process of getting particularly the standard profile implemented as a set of recipes, that really brought to light a lot of the config actions that were needed to be able to make this sort of a fully featured feature within Drupal. So it was probably about mid 2024, I want to say around July, that phase 1 was complete. There continues to be some work in terms of making the minimal and umami profiles converted into recipes. Certainly later in the year, Drupal 11 was released, and there were lots of improvements in there. Drupal CMS has itself also driven a lot of work that's gone on into recipes. So if you look at like the set of configurations before Drupal 10.3 was probably like quite short. Once it got to 11, much broader. And then I would say Drupal CMS specifically drew a further expansion that we see in like 11.1 and 10.4. So lots of additional capabilities, lots of new and fun things to play with. But also, understand if you use some of those newer pieces, then your recipes obviously need to require the equivalent or the appropriate version of Drupal as well. So 2 minutes, okay. So I'll move through this pretty quickly. Some of the things that are being worked on. This is probably the most fundamental one. So as we talked about, a recipe includes its own set of dependencies, and then you'll bring those in with Composer. The recipe will bring in a bunch of configuration that depends on those. Notionally, you should be able to remove the recipe from your site, but then you're still going to be left with a bunch of configuration that expects all those dependencies to be there and running, which is going to leave your site in kind of a broken space. So this idea of unpacking is to be able to say, go through, figure out what are all of the dependencies that were brought into my site because I applied this recipe, and now move those into the site's composer.json so that now I can get rid of the recipe, but the site will continue to work again as though I had individually gone through, pulled those in, and configured them myself. So that's something. There is a merge request. I think it's now on its second or third time as needs review. So hopefully it's getting closer. But it's, again, one of those things that's not sort of a huge issue, but I think it will definitely be a huge improvement to the recipe system as a whole. Config validation, I think we've kind of covered, so maybe we'll move on. We talked about how config actions have sort of this idea of wildcards to make them more dynamic, but now there's this idea of having kind of like placeholders. So where some permissions require an actual like ID value of, like in this case, a bundle, you can put sort of a placeholder in there and it'll actually go through and iterate for those based on all of the available bundles in that specific case. So here are some of the roadmap items. We talked about, unpacking. There's things like not allowing them to be used in parallel. One that actually is part of what shipped in 11.1 is recipes can now ask for user input. So if you need to include like a Google Maps API key or OpenAI key was the other one I was going to use, the recipe can prompt for that so that at the end of applying that recipe, you have a system that's ready to use, as opposed to the user having to like, oh, it doesn't work. Oh, well, it's because it needs this, key and I have to go and all of that stuff. So again, making it a better, more seamless end-to-end experience. There's been a lot of work on documentation. Today it lives in GitHub, which is not really the best place for documentation. So there's good documentation, but it needs to get ported over and finished. So certainly if you want to get involved, that's a good place to get started, is with documentation. Testing was something we talked about earlier, definitely also valuable for recipes. There's a recipes channel in Drupal Slack, and every other Tuesday in there, there's an asynchronous meeting. So lots of good options if you want to jump in and get involved. So that's the talk about recipes, and hopefully we can chat some more about it a little bit later in the afternoon.
Thank you.